Good morning, everybody. The subject of today's webinar is, of course, defence modernisation and early lessons from the Ukraine conflict. And so my colleagues will, of course, be talking about Ukraine. However, for my part, I believe that as a result of this conflict, the defence and security industry in the Western world will never be the same again in our generation. And indeed, many countries will be taking a fresh look at the structure of their armed forces and their capability mix. In the meanwhile, our thoughts and prayers go to the people of Ukraine at this tragic time, and let us hope there will soon be a satisfactory resolution to this crisis. Before introducing our speakers, I would like to tell you a little bit about Universal Defence and Security Solutions. We are a global defence consultancy providing specialist defence and wider security advice, assistance, and solutions to governments as well as businesses. Research has revealed that we are unique in the world, as we have the largest pool of former UK military, with over 500 people, from 4-star to warrant officer across land, sea, air, and civil service. As a result, we're able to provide policy and strategy through to technical advice across the entire breadth of the defence and security sectors, and in all domains, including cyber and space. We work in tandem with the UK MOD, FCO, and Department for International Trade, and are able to offer the best of UK defence knowledge on all aspects of defence, including modernisation, innovation, and acquisition. We have specialist former senior UK National Crime Agency partners that have international experience in issues such as policing, corruption, drug interdiction, cyber, and border security. Furthermore, we're able to arrange financing for our projects, including for acquisitions, training, through life maintenance costs, as well as the less tangible elements such as border security and policing. So it's my great pleasure to introduce my colleagues, almost all of whom are now TV stars with regular slots on both radio and TV. And first to speak will be my co-founder and co-chairman, General Sir Richard Barrons. Before UDSS, Richard served as Commander, Joint Forces Command until April 2016 as one of the 6 Chiefs of Staff, leading the UK Armed Forces, where he was responsible for some 23,000 people worldwide and a budget of 4.3 billion. This delivered intelligence, special forces, operational command and control, surveillance, reconnaissance and information systems, and communications, operational logistics, medical support, and advanced education and training across the armed forces. Richard is one of the leading authorities on how the digital age will transform defence and security. Next to speak will be my co-director, Air Marshal Phil Osborn, and during over 3 decades in UK defence, Phil has accrued extensive experience of leadership and command, intelligence and cyber, force design and capability planning and transformation. Originally Tornado Aircrew, most recently he was Chief of the Defence Intelligence until the end of 2018, responsible for the provision of strategic intelligence to defence and government, ISR coordination and counterintelligence, as well as defence leadership of offensive and defensive cyber. Previously, Phil commanded one of the 2 operational RAF groups and stood up the 2.5 billion a year Joint Forces Command, now called Strategic Command, capability portfolio. And finally to speak will be another one of my co-directors, Major General David Shouesmith. David has had a 28-year military career with particular focus on operational military logistics, support and acquisition in both the MOD and the commercial sector. His military career included service as Assistant Chief of the Defence Staff for Logistic Operations, as well as Logistic Command from squadron to brigade level, including being on operations from Bosnia to Afghanistan. He's also been responsible for instigating a range of acquisition and support transformation initiatives across defence. And since leaving the military some 12 years ago, David has advised a number of companies in strategy, critical program management, and strategic supply chain. So now over to you, Richard.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the this UDSS webinar. I'm going to set the scene a bit on the background to this war, the progress so far, and conclude with some observations on what this means for defense transformation, bearing in mind we're all learning as we go. And the thing I'd like to start with is some comments on the geostrategic context, because it's quite easy in the hurly-burly of the war as it ebbs and flows to lose sight of some of the, I would say, political realism that underpins this. The first thing, from a Western perspective, we can claim what's happening in Ukraine is a shock, but we can't really claim it's a surprise, because plenty of analysts and intelligence folk have been describing for more than 10 years how Russia was evolving and the sort of thing it was minded to do, and it's now done it. And at the second level, it's not a surprise, because we all watched for some months how the Ukrainian forces arrayed themselves to deal with what they saw as a very large Russian force appearing on its borders in numbers up to 200,000. So we might claim that we didn't take enough notice of our own intelligence and analysis. The second observation is, I think people are coming to accept that what's happening in Ukraine is a failure of Western deterrence at two levels. The first level is to recognize that after the invasion of Crimea in 2014, we did not do enough to assist Ukraine with capacity building to either deter or defeat a Russian invasion that everyone was talking about. And at a more strategic level, we should recognize that NATO as an alliance did not create a picture in the mind of President Putin and others that would deter him from taking this sort of action. So a failure of Western deterrence in the round. And related to that, I think we have to acknowledge that the difference between latent power and mobilized power. Russia, an economy about the size of Spain, roughly 130 million people, a GDP of about 1.3 trillion, has aggressively mobilized its resources and has delivered a military instrument that is capable of furthering its objectives. The West, meanwhile, with far more latent power, and the EU alone, a GDP of about 15 trillion before you add the UK and before you add the US. So the West is far more powerful, and once mobilized will certainly prevail. But we're currently in a situation where Russia has mobilized what it has, and the West has very largely failed to deter it by essentially being comfortable and asleep. The fourth thing I would make, and this will be clear to everybody, is nuclear weapons are back in play here, both at the tactical, the operational level, and the strategic level. That's not really a conversation we've had, really, I think, since the end of the Cold War, but the predominance in the backdrop to this conflict is clear. And my final point on realism is, I think with hindsight, we'll see Ukraine as the inflection event in a much bigger process that marks the transition of us all from the what was identified as the post-Cold War era, relatively comfortable period for the West, and the onset of this new world order. And it's interesting how many commentators are now focused on this struggle between liberal democracy as it's espoused in the West and autocratic capitalism in the shape of both Russia and, of course, China and elsewhere. In terms of the war so far, we should recognize that in Moscow, there's been a failure of effective politics and process. The degree of hubris, the narrative that they have constructed around this, the intelligence process that has converted what must be a reasonable understanding of what really is going on in Ukraine before and during the war into essentially words that support a preconditioned narrative. The all-pervasive effect of corruption and over-centralization. This, I think, has exposed the Moscow kleptocracy in all its failings, which is not to say that it may not prevail or it may not recover, but clearly it's a very difficult picture. And what we're seeing in Russia, two things that are, I think, important. One is a society split by age and access to media. The roughly 80 million or so who get their news through state media, broadly supportive of the war, and there's a cultural dimension to that. And the internet generation, and perhaps the more urban young who have access to the internet, who tend to see it in a different way. This is a tension in Russia that will take some time to resolve. And on top of all that, we should recognize since 2014, Russia has built a machinery for the repression of civil dissent and disobedience, which is powerful and won't break easily or quickly. And then at the level of the armed forces, I think very few Russia watchers expected the Russian military to fail so spectacularly in the way it has gone about this. There's clearly been a failure of leadership. We're seeing the effects of endemic corruption in things like equipment support, even in the provision of rations. We've seen command and control weakness at the level of how the campaign is constructed and coordinated, and right down to failures of leadership at the most basic level. Typically, young, very inexperienced, often conscript soldiers left outside to fend for themselves, officers having withdrawn somewhere safer and warmer. Beyond all that, an astonishing failure of preparation and planning. Typically, many units fed into this fight on the basis of about 12 to 24 hours warning, and on the basis of a narrative which was clearly false. All of that amplified by significant training deficiencies, both on the ground and in the inability to do combined arms warfare really above battalion group level, and a massive failure of air-ground coordination. Osby is going to talk a bit more about the air dimension. Despite having a lot of very good equipment, clear fragility in the way that it's been maintained and deployed, the inability to do logistics at scale or indeed thoughtfully, and remarkable failings in medical support, both in terms of dealing with the wounded, and we should also acknowledge apparently great failures in dealing with the dead, where there are probably 7,000 to 8,000 fatalities. So no wonder morale is low. And having said all of that, I think we would recognize that Russia has vastly bigger forces. It's used probably 40% of its ground forces so far. It's capable of learning and responding to failure. And we're now clearly seeing some sort of reset to the campaign to cause them to sequence battles rather than do so much concurrently, and probably to employ mass fires in an indiscriminate way over the various forms of maneuver that they've tried. So there is no script to this, and we shouldn't even think we're maybe even at halfway in this conflict. And for all its many failings, the sheer size of the Russian war machine has the ability to prevail if it sorts itself out. And when it does that, it's still going to bump into the reality that it thought it was going to conduct an occupation by consent. It's actually conducting an occupation by brute force. And in order to sustain that, it'll have to deploy more brute force. And it doesn't look like they really have committed themselves to that. Turning to Ukraine, well, in rehearsal since 2014, no surprise to them how the Russians have acted, but I think a surprise to them too, just how badly tactically this has gone. And the truth is this very effective military force is capable of delay, done very well, but not deterrence. That clearly wasn't enough. And it doesn't have the ability to defeat the Russians at scale or to take the offensive beyond local counterattacks, at least not yet. So around Kiev, it seems pretty clear the Russians don't have the ability to take the city, but they can harass it and destroy chunks of it. And the Ukrainians don't have the ability to destroy the Russian forces that are encircling the city, at least not yet. Nonetheless, interestingly, the Ukraine military now connected to the West arsenals, economies, and industry. So sustaining the current fight as we transition from handing over weapons that we have in our cupboards to weapons that our industry makes is still looks to me doable, particularly with the US in support. And therefore, this could be sustained for some time. I think the Ukrainians accept there'll be no-fly zone or NATO military intervention. This is never going to escalate easily from a war between Russia and Ukraine to a war between NATO and Russia, at least not unless NATO comes to the view that it could dictate the terms of that, and they're not in that place yet. So the final thing on Ukrainian military we should recognize is building the offensive capability to eject the Russians would be a long-term project involving substantial re-equipping and training, and were we to go down that road, it's at least 2 years' work. So nothing quick about that either. I want to talk a little bit about technology, because some things that we knew before the war have been reaffirmed. And the first is we're dealing with a transparent battle space, combination of what you can see from space, from air-breathing aircraft, from drones, discovered from electronic warfare, established from data, particularly open source data and other access to the internet. So this layered multi-dimension ISR integrated into big data is here to stay. There is no such thing now as the ability to sneak up at scale on anybody at state level in state level conflict. The second point, again, not new, is we're seeing the primacy of precision weapons, both short range and longer range over, yes, platforms, but infrastructure and indeed maneuver. But what we've also encountered in this war is the primacy of precision only works if you're good enough at using it. And the Ukrainians seem to have an edge there, at least at the tactical level, and you have enough stock. And Russia have fired of the order of 1,100 missiles so far, and of course we have no idea what's left in the cupboard. Most Western nations will now be looking at their stock level and wondering what they need to do about it. Third point I make is ground-based air and missile defense has once again asserted itself as the first requirement for operations in great power conflict, after 30 years of it being steadily relegated as a result of not being so clearly required in Iraq and Afghanistan and other places like that. Again, most Western nations, and I think many nations, will be looking at their ground-based air defense and working very quickly to reset it. Certainly the case in the UK. Fourth point would be, despite people's preference for precision and talking about cyber, indirect fire, whether that's dumb bombs or rocket and tube artillery, is still by far the biggest killer. And therefore obviously irrelevant to a no-fly zone, by the way. But we should recognize that the brute use of indirect area fires against military and, it seems in this case, civil targets is still very much with us. That cannot be a surprise, having seen the journey from Aleppo, well, I suppose Grozny through Aleppo and onto Ukraine. And two other points on technology. Robust encrypted command and control is decisive, managing voice and data over strong networks with the right level of encryption. For example, where the Russians have encrypted networks have collapsed and they've defaulted to open radio transmission and mobile phones, it has often been to their great disadvantage. And indeed, both sides are using the internet, but the internet still needs electricity. And I just point out to you that Elon Musk's low Earth orbit satellites and the terminals he's issued, particularly to hospitals, are creating an internet that does not rely on the normal commercial infrastructure or power networks. Probably a big lesson in there. And to conclude on wider defense transformation, early days, of course, but it's clear that the full multi-domain orchestra of war is in play in Ukraine. So information, fires, maneuver and support, all of those things armies, navies and air forces know they need to fight in a multi-domain context, and of course supported by cyber and social media manipulation. I think this conflict has put to bed the idea that war in the 21st century is just about cyber and social media manipulation. And to do multi-domain conflict well, it requires not just kit, but as the Russians have demonstrated, it requires kit, yes, but people, training and support. And unless you have all four parts of capability in place, you're not going to prosper. Second point is, again, that mass matters. in a way that it didn't very much for the post-Cold War discretionary interventions around the world. But many nations are now seeing that they'll restore mass, not in a way that's reminiscent of the 1990s, but through these evolving manned, unmanned, and increasingly autonomous orbats. And that's a competition underway now, and I think it will now accelerate. The third point is, in this world we fight in, that the narrative battle is as important as it's always been. It's as important as the fighting, but the means of doing it have expanded. So from TV to TikTok, and the armed forces that manage that better will create an edge, not just with their own people and the people they're fighting amongst, but in the international community more widely. Look at Ukraine, how Ukraine has managed that. The fourth point is control of the air and air-ground coordination are as vital as ever. Osby will come back to that. Again, that's not news to many Western armed forces, but the scale at which this has to be done, I think, is being refreshed. And two final points. First, for those armies in the West, armed forces in the West, that are focused on ever smaller regular forces, the war in Ukraine is showing that strong reserves and mobilization planning are key to mass and endurance and actually skills. And most of that will need refreshing as we go forward. And finally, and again, not new, but starkly shown by the poor Russian performance, logistics and medical capacity that match the force you want to deploy and your ambitions are as vital as having enough weapons and people. And what we're seeing now, I think, particularly in the relationship between the Ukrainian armed forces and the West, is how the logistic and medical capability runs from the front line all the way through to industry and civil society. And maybe many of us will have to rethink how that works. That's from me. Back, I think, to Osby.
Good morning. And I'm going to pick up on some of the things that Richard's already highlighted, but from an air point of view. I'm not going to touch on cyber and other bits of the electromagnetic spectrum. You might want to pick up on some of that in questions. Picking up on one of Richard's last points, I think it's probably worth us thinking about the fact that the spectrum of capability is required across the spectrum of conflict. And what we're seeing, obviously, is the harder end of that spectrum of capability. And therefore, some of the enduring lessons in the air environment are enduring for a reason. It doesn't matter what century you're in, some things remain true. And probably the first thing to pull out is that contested air wars are difficult, really difficult. As an old Cold War warrior, and I look at what's going on now, there are some things which remain as relevant today as perhaps some 10 or 20 years ago. The first is that any fighting force has to have the essential foundations of training, of morale, and of command and control. And if you don't have those, technology can't buy you any or all of those fundamental underpinning elements. And then it's really difficult to do offensive air when you don't control the airspace, especially if you're trying to target, trying to influence mobile or relocating targets. This is something that we have known for a long time. This is particularly true if you're hampered by the lack of real-time intelligence, perhaps to some extent because you don't control the air. It's hampered by a lack of precision weapons, which are limited anyway if you lack real-time intelligence, and it will be limited by the weather, which is always a factor with air operations. And what all of this means is that you tend to strike the wrong targets really accurately from hundreds of miles away, or you have to go below 25,000 feet or so, which leads you to the next lesson, which is MANPADS, man-portable air defense systems, can be really lethal, especially if the enemy has come to you and if you have to come down as the enemy to below 25,000 feet. So what we're seeing today is tactical air defense systems, because of the context, having a real, actually disproportionate, but entirely appropriate effect at the operational and perhaps even the strategic level. Now, what that tells us is that actually how much you need to control the air probably depends on what you want to do. So from a Ukrainian perspective, for some of their military context, actually local air control or actually some level of balance is more than enough to operate tactical drones, especially in an environment where those drones, because of their nature, are relatively invulnerable to other air defense systems. But we do need to bear in mind that those tactical contexts are purely that, they're tactical. And I guess there's a question there as to we shouldn't forget that if you need to counter more strategic threats, let's say cruise or ballistic missiles, then you need different capabilities. Another one of those strategic threats might be a competent air force, which is set on seizing theatre-wide air control to then enable successful ground and maritime operations. So learning the right lessons and therefore a balanced air capability is probably important for us. Because what we do know, and as Richard has underlined, if you fail in the air, you tend to fail everywhere else. So some enduring lessons, perhaps some new-ish lessons, some things which we probably knew, but what we're currently seeing is underlining. We've not seen much thus far on cyber and space disruption. Now, some of it we haven't seen, some of it we're not aware of, and some of it is being held back. And I think probably in retrospect, we'll understand a little bit more about decisions that have been made to keep this conflict in a fairly constrained theatre. But what it is telling us is that forces and force planning must cope with reality, or at least a really likely reality. It cannot be and should not be based around what we wish. And I think the UK and other nations sometimes do their capability planning around what they wish to see rather than what they may see. Drones really have come to life, I would offer, in this conflict, but also in a couple previously. And it's obvious that they can be dominant when they fit the circumstances. So, for example, uncontested air control gives time for precise intelligence and then targeting. What we're also seeing more of is that drones, sometimes in swarms and sometimes alone, can be devastating tactically. This is a genie that will not go back in the box, and nor should it, because unmanned and autonomous systems are clearly the future. Technology and cost will shift to increase capability, but this capability will not recede in its importance. But what underlines all our operations is what underlines all operations across all domains. It's the need for great intelligence and information. It's the need for great connectivity and security and control of the electromagnetic spectrum. And it's the need for integration across domains. And what we're seeing increasingly, I think, in the Ukrainian conflict is that that integration has to include allies and industries. Even relatively short wars, and this I do not think is going to be short, but even relatively short wars engage the breadth of a national capability and a national enterprise, and therefore allies and industry and the integration across them, I think is essential. I'm going to hand over to David. David.
Richard, thanks very much. I'm going to spend a couple of minutes talking about some of the logistic implications for future defence modernisation planning from what we've seen so far in Ukraine. And Richard has touched upon some of these points. Maybe I'll start by just highlighting a couple of the trends, non-military trends in logistics that we've seen really over the last 30 plus years. We've seen an explosion in the availability of data, which enables companies, whether they're selling cars or whether they're selling cabbages, to really get ahead of the demand predictions. So that enables them to tee up their manufacturing more precisely and stock their shelves in a way that they probably haven't been able to before the advent of serious computing power. So an explosion of data availability in the commercial logistics world has transformed how companies go about planning and executing their logistics. And the other transformative force, amongst a couple of others actually, is what I would call the Amazon effect. So a combination of digital plus the responsiveness that's been generated by Amazon and and other companies that you can order something on your smartphone at 10 o'clock at night, it'll turn up the following morning, or you can order, some takeaway food and there's a knock on the door an hour later. That creates a level of expectation across everybody, including people in the military, that we can effect the same sort of service when we're delivering bombs, bullets, rations, and the rest of it. So those two trends have really driven commercial logistics down a route of just in time, really lean supply chains, looking to source things overseas, but created a level of expectation that stuff is always available at the press of a button on the smartphone. I think Ukraine is a reminder to us that when we get into the realm of military logistics, life isn't quite like that. There's certainly an opportunity to exploit the growth in the availability of data, particularly looking around consumption rates, whether it's artillery ammunition, small arms ammunition, whatever. The application of AI to be a bit more accurate in predicting future consumption rates, and visibility of stocks throughout the supply chain, so we know what's where and when. And if we can extend that even into industry, we get a feel for lead times and how quickly things can be replaced, replenished, or indeed production ramped up. So we've absolutely seen in the West, at least, an expansion in the availability of data from factory to foxhole, as they say in the UK. Still more to do on that journey. But data only gets you so far in the land logistics environment anyway. And for those of you who are Star Trek fans who remember the expression "beam me up, Scotty," until that technology exists where we can beam stuff from point A to point B, we are left with the physical reality of having to transport stuff. And we're having to transport stuff and store stuff in fundamentally hostile environments. So that means you have to have military trained logisticians to be able to fight their way through with their fuel, their ammunition, so on, and military trained logisticians that can actually defend the locations where these things are stored, albeit maybe stored only temporarily. And when we look at future force design, how you structure future forces, although we'd like to have more gunners, more airmen, more infantry soldiers, we absolutely, if we want to be serious about carrying out land operations at some sort of distance, we absolutely have to train in our logistic elements. And that means drivers, it means store people, it means combat medics, and so on and so forth. Because these are not things that you can do with industry when you're operating in a hostile environment. So the physical realities of moving things from point A to point B remain one of those enduring lessons that have endured since the time of Alexander the Great, actually. And there's nothing in the Ukraine conflict that says that things have fundamentally changed. Yes, data has improved visibility, but we still need to invest in creating the force components that will absolutely be able to move and store stuff under a hostile environment. There's also, and Richard mentioned it, the need to invest in good equipment and the need to invest in reliability. And if you know your kit is going to fail, then you need to come up with a plan that enables you to compensate for those failures. And I well remember in the first Gulf War, the British general, when he was planning his armoured advances, always planned to have a spare armoured squadron because he was anticipating the failure of the whole squadron within his armoured regiments. That was recognised in the reality of the equipment that we had at the time. And he came up with a plan to compensate for that. So that's the reality, if you like, of integrating your logistics into your operational planning. So I think in terms of force modernisation, in the logistic domain, absolutely continue to invest in data. So we understand where stuff is from factory to foxhole. That's absolutely essential. But there's also a need to invest in the physical transport and the physical stockholding capability in a deployed environment. In a hostile environment, where you might have to fight the logistics through, and you might have to hold your storage area. That means investing also in training, the point that Richard made, and in training not just your logisticians in isolation, but your logisticians in the context of all arms land operations. And I think there's a need to invest in good and reliable kit. Kit that breaks down, kit that doesn't have the capability, perhaps the protection that you need, is not going to be any good to you. So investing in good, reliable logistic kit is absolutely essential. And there's a broader issue here about investing in acquisition practices. And there's a suggestion that perhaps the Russian acquisition system has not delivered it the equipment that it needs, or perhaps it's delivered it the equipment that it deserves. So if you've got an acquisition system in which corruption is endemic, that will inevitably hollow out the quality and the quantity of equipment you've got. So investing in an acquisition system that delivers you the right kit is a really essential systemic improvement to which militaries should look at. And as a byproduct of that, investing in relationships with industry. So you understand when industry is pulling the wool over your eyes, and you understand exactly what industry can deliver and can't deliver. Better still, a relationship with industry that allows the best equipment at the best price in a mutually understanding relationship is really what one should aim for. So there you go, a bit on force structure, invest in your logistics, absolutely grab every bit of data that you can, but also grow that relationship with industry to build an acquisition system that gives people the right kit that they need in order to carry out these sorts of operations. That's it from me. I'll hand back to Peter. Thank you.
And thank you, speakers. So some questions have arisen, and just I'd like to ask Richard, do you think the Russians actually chose the wrong time of year to commence these operations?
I think we have to go back to the three Russian failures of the incursion that started on the 24th of February, because at the very start they had persuaded themselves that this would be essentially an occupation by consent, executable by rapidly moving light forces with some precision fire support and support from the air, done and dusted in 2 days. And in that context, the weather really wouldn't have mattered, because it wasn't really a factor in a 2-day sweep to victory. In the transition that then occurred when that failed, to bringing in combinations of heavier forces, although not terribly successfully, they then clearly found that they were confined to roads, both in terms of the heavier kit and the wheeled vehicles, and made much worse by the fact the Ukrainian military thoughtfully dropped some bridges, and the Russian logistic planning meant that quite a lot of the stuff, second and third line logistics and bridging kit, was well down the back of the queue. So then they found that the time of year was not helpful to them because of the thaw in some areas, and yet elsewhere there are reports of 50% of the ground troops now suffering from frostbite because there were some very cold snaps when they were confined to armored vehicles that were running out of fuel. So I think based on their original preconception, the time of year, do it by the end of February when the ground is hard because it's really quick, probably looked right in their eyes. And then I think it unraveled, and they would have been much wiser to wait if they knew what sort of fight they were really going to have until the ground was harder and the skies were probably clearer. Over.
Thanks, Richard. For Osby, you talked about real-time intelligence, and it's not difficult to imagine how essential that is on the battlefield. But what do you think the sort of comparisons between Ukraine and Russia's capabilities are? Do you think one has superior real-time intelligence over the other, or are they probably even?
I think it's probably fair to say that there's a lot of focus at the moment on on the transfer of materiel to Ukraine, I'm convinced that it's not just materiel that's being transferred to Ukraine. So you've got a flow of intelligence, which frankly was to an extent in place when I was still in UK defence. So there's something here about the power of alliances, which is not just in the physical domain. There's the power of alliances in terms of information and intelligence as well, and what you can rely on others for, or perhaps what is an occasional benefit, depending on what alliance you have, is something that's got to be absolutely in play in any operational calculus. What I'd also say, though, is Richard mentioned it. There's something here about a total lack of transparency. There will be some things which remain secret. What people think will remain secret, but there's not much else. So what I think we're seeing from an open source perspective will be something similar to what armed services are currently seeing in a more classified space. They just might be getting tone and color, which is ahead of what we're seeing in the open source space, or actually gives them more emphasis on the various options that are available to them. But I don't think this is a tussle between Ukrainian intelligence and Russia. I think the Ukrainian intelligence foundation is much, much broader.
Thank you. David, you talked about artificial intelligence and how that will change predicting demand on the battlefield. Could you expand a little bit more on that? Because clearly, if one can predict where certain supplies and stores are needed at certain times, then this is going to be a presumably significant advantage to whichever country has that capability.
Yeah, I wouldn't want to overplay that. I think there are so many variables in the military domain. There's so many variables. People's willingness to fight, predicted consumption rates for a particular operation, as opposed to planned operation, as opposed to having to respond to something that comes as a surprise. There are lots of uncertainties there, which I think are more difficult to model and read with AI than perhaps in a retail environment or an automotive environment or some other sort of production environment. But that having been said, it doesn't mean that it can't provide some value. And I think anything that improves an understanding of likely demand is enormously helpful when you're then planning how to deliver that demand. So I think it has its place, and I think the more it gets fed into a broader context of synthetic training, learning the lessons of Operation A, B, C, D, so that the machine can start to understand how to manage all those variables, then the better it's going to be. But I think the scope for those really big factors to throw a spanner in the works of what would otherwise be some quite reliable AI will always remain. But I go back to my point in terms of where one should put the balance of effort and investment in planning force capability, if you like, in logistics. I think it's easy to be seduced by the attraction of digital to transform logistics. I think it's relatively dull to have to face the reality that you still need hundreds of trucks and a whole load of people to be able to physically transport stuff. So I just think we need to get that context right. We'll absolutely take anything that AI can give us, but let's not lose sight of you can have the best AI in the world. If you don't have trucks and people and a protection cocoon around them, then you're still not going to get the stuff.
Yeah, thanks, David. So for Richard, a couple of questions, if I may. Just sort of building on that AI theme, presumably this will ultimately end up with a sort of digital twin of the proposed battlefield as best as one can, and with AI taking a big part in how you sort of deal with those issues that come up. So that was the first question. And the second one is a bit broader about NATO. Where do you feel NATO is going to go from here? What do you think? Are there going to be any more developed responses, or is it going to remain very much as is now?
So, well, two questions I think are connected. I think the first thing, and we've all touched on this in our contributions this morning, is that we recognise that one of the key chief aspects of the transformation of defence and security for the digital age will be that we'll move from a world where we bought platforms, ships, tanks, and aircraft, and then bolted radios and similar capability to them so they could connect and communicate. And where we're going in the future is armed forces will be built around a digital backbone, which will be a combination of secure data in the cloud, because that's the only place you can manage data at the right volume. That data managed by artificial intelligence, which in many cases will be AI that has been worked out in the civil sector and is applied to defense. So not much ab initio research. The operating environment will be replicated in these very large scale synthetic environments that replicate an operating environment at the scale of a country or an alliance in their physical, human, cognitive, and resource dimensions. And that's how the chain of command is connected top to bottom, and how allies are connected in the same visualization and tool. And then all of that will be supported by really powerful networks, which are cyber resilient and where bandwidth isn't really a constraint. And capability, ships, tanks, aircraft, and all of that will plug into that backbone in an inversion of the old arrangement. And I think the Ukraine conflict will accelerate how that happens within the NATO alliance, and also how the NATO alliance and the EU are connected to Ukraine by having, for example, a common synthetic environment and better and more resilient networks. On the wider question, I think this will take some time to become clear, because the West is a bit divided between those that think this will be a long war and those that would just like it done quickly so we can, quote, get back to normal jogging, which I don't think actually will ever apply now. So I think NATO is going to, in the short term, recognize its massive debt and obligation to Ukraine. Ukraine is taking a hit in the way that it is for the reasons I described earlier, sort of dual failure of deterrence. And that obligation will be met by coping with very large numbers of refugees, typically now beyond 3 million, could get to 5, because looking after the refugees well sustains the fight in Ukraine. And as I described, connecting the Ukrainian military to our stock and our industry and our economies to sustain the fight that they are having, at least in part on our behalf. And then NATO will recognize it is locked in a very difficult relationship with Russia, certainly Russia under Putin, for the foreseeable future. And that will require NATO to do 3 things concurrently: reset its resilience, so that being an important part of deterrence. And many nations in Europe have forgotten about resilience because we had until recently not felt existential peril. So the resilience of the armed forces, of industry, continuity of government and civil society in the physical, human and cognitive dimensions is a big theme. It's a big theme for UDSS. It'll be a big theme for many countries. The second thing that the NATO will do, I guess, in partnership with member states and with the European Union, is establish how to conduct an enduring hybrid campaign focused initially on Russia. So all the levers of power short of the military instrument, and that essentially comes down to sanctions and messaging and all the sort of cultural isolation that Russia is experiencing right now, in order to rebalance the terms of the dialogue between the West and Russia to one that recognizes that the West is way more powerful than Russia once mobilized, and now we're mobilizing. And Russia, if it wants to find a place in the world that reflects its actual interests, it will have to come to terms. That doesn't mean regime change, of course, but it does mean a different relationship with Russia. And then the third thing will be this transformation of military hard power, mostly through the application of digital age technology and method. And I think here, and it is fascinating, we're seeing Germany set the pace, 100 billion euros into a fund this year, reaching up to 2% of GDP for at least the next 4 or 5 years. Conversation just this week about establishing the comprehensive air and missile defense that we've highlighted this morning as essential to all outcomes, and a modernization of its armed forces that will not end up being just having more of the stuff they used to have in the 1990s when they last worried about war, but modern stuff, the manned, unmanned, autonomous mix. I think many other Western European nations will follow, as will the US. So that trilogy of reset resilience, build hybrid campaigning capability, and collectivize it with our alliances and transform military hard power is obviously a journey focused initially on Russia, and then the West will realize that this is actually about setting the scene for a conversation with China as it comes to be more dominant in our world, where if we want to be taken seriously, we will have to stand up for our interests. That's not in any way suggesting it need be a fight, but one of the features of this struggle with Ukraine is suddenly the West has realized, despite all the warnings, as I said, for more than 10 years, that if it wants to protect its security, its prosperity, and its values, it will have to stand up for it, and it can't just assume the world will operate in the way that it has for the last 30 years, because it clearly won't. Back to you, Peter.
Thank you, Richard. Before we close off, because we're obviously running out of time, panelists, do you have any other comments that you would wish to make before we close down? No? Good. Okay. Thank you very much, everybody, for listening. And as always, a truly fascinating discussion. Thank you so much. And may I wish you a good day.